And I'm returned. Oh, great, I've got the recording on already. Thanks, Varka. All right. So I'll go ahead and get started with the housekeeping business so that we have more time for our most excellent speaker. Welcome, thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Leah Watkins, and I am with the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, who is the organizer of this webinar series that you're joining us on today. So this series is called Do No Harm, a Fresh Perspective on Anti-Human Trafficking Work. I will open with a land acknowledgement. So you folks are joining us from across Turtle Island, but the location of Collaborative Network to End Exploitation is on Takaranto. So Takaranto has been home to many nations since time immemorial. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. These nations were irrevocably harmed by the arrival of European settlers who have systematically tried to erase these Indigenous communities and their teachings. In our ongoing journey towards reconciliation, we are relearning the history of this country and this land, critically examining the ways we have benefited from systemic racism. We are committed to redressing these harms. So this webinar series, Do No Harm, is funded by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto and organized by the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation. All of our presenters represent their own views. You will be muted with cameras off for the presentation portion. I'll also be closing the chat box just to avoid the distractions during the presentation. Towards the end of the presentation, we'll be turning that chat box back on and you'll be able to pop your questions and comments in at that time. We are recording this. You'll have access to that recording later, and you can access also recordings of our previous webinars. And cart captions are available and can be turned on at any time. If you look for that little CC emblem at the bottom on the ribbon of your Zoom screen. So Do No Harm is a webinar series that the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation has organized to help folks who are working in the anti-human trafficking field to examine some of the ways that they maybe unintentionally are causing harm, and to learn some new practices and new ways of doing this work that are anti-oppressive and that are truly rooted in solidarity. So here you can see that today is the accumulation of this 6-part series. And today's focus is on Indigenous voices and perspectives on human trafficking, but we do encourage you to go back and look at the other videos as well. And we've found, as we're going through this series, we've become aware of a few more gaps. And so sort of stay tuned for some follow-up email and communication from us about having some future events where we will hear from some other communities that weren't included in this sort of first round, as it were, of this series. A couple of assumptions. We are assuming that all of the people on this webinar are already familiar with the topic of human trafficking and what anti-human trafficking work entails. We're not doing human trafficking 101. We're assuming that you're here with good intentions. You want to learn more. And that you understand that discomfort is part of growth. So here I've added a quote from Brene Brown that says, "I'm here to get it right, not to be right." So thank you for coming with an open heart, open ears, open minds, to maybe feel uncomfortable and reflect on some practices that you may be engaging in that are creating some harm. So today's presenter is Melissa or Mel Compton. And she is a multilateral Mi'kmaq Scottish artist who uses her lived experience, artwork, and therapeutic skills to develop and facilitate specialized youth programs. Spending a lot of her time in the urban Indigenous community, Mel advocates on behalf of Indigenous youth to ensure their voices are acknowledged. Mel's knowledge comes from lived experience and a vast amount of program workshop development and facilitation that allows for skill development, positive identity, and engagement. Her work as a peer support worker, frontline case manager, anti-human trafficking worker, and now manager of culture and wellness programming has enhanced her ability to develop and provide programming that infuses child and youth care perspectives and cultural perspective through the lens of two-eyed seeing, a concept or teaching held by Elder Albert Marshall. Mel has developed trainings that were delivered to child welfare, frontline case managers, hospital staff, victim services, and crisis counselors. He has also developed and facilitated education sessions around Indigenous history and connection to human trafficking that has been provided to foster parents, caregivers, youth, and to non-Indigenous agencies to support the growth and understanding of the unique needs of the Indigenous population. Mel has been on several panels, spoken at conferences, and has provided guest lectures. She is actively sought by different agencies and social justice groups to share both her personal and professional journeys. Mel now works at Canadian Roots Exchange as the manager of culture and wellness programming, in which she creates, supports, and co-facilitates upwards of 6 youth programs addressing multiple topics. We're really thrilled to have you here, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I was giggling at that because I need to update my bio. In the last couple of weeks, I have shifted into a manager position, but I was also recovering from being ill, and so there's a little bit of a shift that has taken place while I was sick, and so that all needs to be updated. So, Kwe, hello. Television Malgiganama Diz Eshik Jagamij e Mal Compton, Television Tomgok e Wiki Takaranto. So I'm Mel Compton. My spirit name is Strong Tree Spirit. I'm Mi'kmaq Caribou Clan from the East Coast, primarily from Newfoundland, although I do have family across the Maritime provinces who identify as Mi'kmaq, and we are looking into our Maliseet lineage now. So that's something that has come up in the last couple of weeks. I was born and raised in Toronto, Takaranto, and I continue to live here, and I do a lot of my work here. I am just going to quickly share my screen. I'm just waiting for the thing to disappear so I can put the slide on. Oh, there we go. Come on. Can everybody see my screen? Couple thumbs up so we can see. Okay, perfect. All right. So these are just some of the titles that have been given to me or that I have had over the years. As was mentioned in my weirdly long bio, I started off in doing youth work while I was a youth myself. I had become a camp counselor and all of those fun things. And then I moved into a peer support role while I was doing my post-secondary education. Something about me is I was not born and raised in my culture. That was something that was laid dormant in my family for quite some time. And you'll begin to understand why as I continue with this presentation. This is something that has impacted my experience and my lived experience on the exploitation spectrum. I was not trafficked. However, I was groomed for trafficking, and I was on the spectrum, like I had mentioned. I had to pick up my culture and my Mi'kmaq identity. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, I started to pick that up while I was in post-secondary. And I say unfortunately because this is something that a lot of our people should have been born into. We should have been able to grow and firmly hold our indigenous identities with us as we walked on our journey from childhood, and many of us didn't. And that is because of the history of colonization. So bear with me, I am going to move quite quick. If you're on a device that you can take screenshots, or if you're on your phone and you can take pictures, please do so, because I am going to move quite quick through a lot of it. There is a lot of information. I did struggle a little bit to put this presentation together because like a lot of people know, like, we don't need to come into this event and talk about what human trafficking is. You already know that, you know the basics, you understand sort of the mechanics of how that works. But when I come in even to basic human trafficking events or panels or discussions, I often ask to go last for a particular reason. And it's because I don't need to have that initial conversation in any context. I need to come in and talk to you about how colonization has impacted our communities and how that leads to an influx, and Indigenous people 12 times more likely to be impacted by this and by victims of violence. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with the treaties, these were our first contracts. These were our first treaties that were put in place across the nations as well as with settler communities when contact happened. If you look at these belts, each of them tells a story. Each image and each pattern of that beadwork was put together in ceremony and under an agreement that was agreed upon by both parties, whoever was involved. The belts look unfinished, and that's for a particular purpose. That meant that these contracts were to be upheld for time immemorial. There was no end date. It was not like the paper contracts that we see. There was absolutely no end date. And for those of you who may be on the call that don't know a lot about this, but a lot of you do, is that obviously we know that these contracts and these treaties were not upheld. When we look at the one in the middle, the reason why I primarily focus on this one is because this talks about, and this is from the Six Nations community, this is not my community. However, a lot of my mentors have been from the Mohawk and Haudenosaunee communities. And the brief, very brief acknowledgement of this belt, when you look at the two purple lines, that's to represent the canoe and the settler vessel. When you look at the white of those beads, those lines represent peace, love, and friendship, peace, love, respect, unity, however, the interchangeable teachings for this. But that meant that you were to walk alongside each other on your journeys, and you were never meant to cross paths and intersect and interfere with the two livelihoods that were taking place. You're meant to walk in those teachings, peace, love, and friendship, unity, respect, reciprocity. We know that that didn't happen. This website is a good starting point for your learning process. If you don't know about the history of colonization, if you want to see more of the timelines in terms of legislation that has impacted Indigenous communities, please check out this website. There are a few things that are missing. It hasn't been updated as of recently, but it is a really good starting point to begin to learn about sort of the self-governance structures that happen pre-contact, as well as the government force structures that were put into place for Indigenous people through the time. So this is my job today. My job is to connect the pieces between colonization and the process of exploitation. We see this chart talking about the process of human trafficking and exploitation. This is the same exact process that colonization took on. This is the beginning. This is the beginning of the manipulation and exploitation. The initial meeting, contact, they began to observe, they began to look, they began to see what they wanted to take. Gifts with invisible strings. We're going to put you on a piece of land. You can farm yourself. You can control what you do on that piece of land. We'll give your children education. We'll provide things for you. And then we know that those were broken promises. So breaking of the spirit. We're going to put you on lands that you cannot farm. We're going to take your children and put them in residential school. We're going to beat them, abuse them, and make sure they come back not knowing who you are, not knowing the language, not knowing their identities. When you take the children away from communities, that you take away the joy, you take away the livelihood of that community. And then obviously there's a level of collateral. The children are collateral, our men were collateral, our women were collateral, our resources were collateral. So there's always something to use for manipulation and exploitation. In human trafficking, same thing, threats of hurting your family or your friends, threats of killing, threats of something. There's debt bondage, there's photos that are taken, et cetera, et cetera. There's always something that is used to uphold that manipulation and exploitation. This is one of the first pieces of written legislation that we see in sort of history. So this idea of the doctrine of discovery and then the amendment. I talk about this because this is the beginning of that written piece. This didn't mean that they just started doing this in 1452. Settlers, when I say they, I'm talking about settlers, they began to travel and try to look for different lands to basically seize control over. And at the beginning, when they realized that they couldn't just go in and take it, and the amendment meant now it was legal to them, they wrote it down saying that it was just a just cause. They could go in, and if they were not Christians, that they could take everything that was there. So this didn't just include what we normally think of when we talk about resources when they go in to extract something from land. Yes, it meant that they could take what was under the land, which was like gold, minerals, basically those resources, but it also meant what was on top of the land. So lumber, it meant plants and vegetation. Then it also moved into the waterways. So shellfish and fish, they could take all of that, they could farm all of those things. But essentially what the amendment allowed was to go in and take our men as slaves to build their labor camps and bring them back with them to Europe or wherever they were going, as well as taking our women and children as that collateral and forcibly marrying off our women into the non-Indigenous community. So my family is primarily from Newfoundland, as I mentioned. Excuse me. And this is some of the history of Newfoundland. John Cabot was somebody who was a part of this settler voyage. And if you look at the words in red, so although they had not seen anybody there, they assumed that they can claim the land. And now I want to mention, it says it's very likely that the Beothuk were living in the area. The Beothuk people are the first peoples of Newfoundland. The Beothuk people do not exist anymore because of this process of colonization. They brought over with them diseases, famine, and dislocation. And so we need to be mindful that sometimes when we're talking about Indigenous communities, the original inhabitants aren't actually there anymore because of this process of colonization. Entire communities were eradicated and wiped out. And then the bottom quote talking about how Native Americans were brought back to be slaves. I do apologize, I might be clearing my throat a lot. I'm still recovering from being sick, but this is just an example of the displacement and disconnection. So when I talk about they came over and began to displace, it was a meticulous and strategic process that happened. They didn't just come in and say, hey, we're going to sweep the land. It was observation. It was critical analysis of what they were going to do, and a plan was put in place. And what they began to do at first was, if you see all of these patches, these are settlements in Nunavut. These are basically like communities that you see. And here's Ontario, right? We have all these little pockets of water and lakes and all things in here. Excuse me. First Nations communities, mostly, especially during spring and summer, they would keep their settlements around water, obviously, because water helps sustain us. And what settler communities would do when they came in is they would begin to break up and put their settlements in between these communities. So say, for example, they would come in and put themselves here. They would put themselves in here. They would come over here, because what they were doing was trying to disconnect one community from the next, because whatever land that they took through the doctrine of discovery, they would take that land, but they would make it almost impossible for you to be able to go around them to get to the other community like you normally would have done historically. And so it broke this connection between different communities. These next two slides, I'm going to say take screenshots and photos of them. I am not going to cover this. If you would like to see an in-depth explanation or process, if you go to the website, helpingtraffickedpeoples.org, I believe, I have 3 webinars that I did on there talking more specifically historical laws, moving into what's happening now, and then the concept of two-eyed seeing and moving forward and what that looks like. Today is just going to be a very brief, quick overview. But pay attention to some of the things that are highlighted in red. These are the very important pieces. And I want to bring your attention to the second last one at the bottom of the screen. In 1884 to 85, and this continued to happen until I believe the late 70s, early 80s. Basically, these laws were embedded into the Indian Act to say that we could not be Indigenous people. We could not be who we were. It was illegal to practice our ceremonies. It was illegal to do powwow. It was illegal to do sweat lodge, sundance. We couldn't come together. We were not allowed to be in pockets and groups of people. If you were found in a group of 3 or more Indigenous people, you would be cited for invoking a riot and you would be arrested. And our people knew at this point, because this has now been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years since the 1400s, we knew that we did not want to be arrested because more often than not, we would not end up coming home, or we would end up missing. This isn't a new concept. This is not a new concept. This is something that has begun from colonization. And since I've pointed to that behind my screen, this is an image that was done by J. Nicole Hatfield. It's titled Invisible No More, and they're an artist from Oklahoma. And then the bottom one, I don't think a lot of people know this, but the RCMP were actually created to assert sovereignty by the Crown over Indigenous people and their lands. We don't own the reserve lands. The reserve lands are held in trust for us by the Queen. So somebody who has realistically no jurisdiction over people in even Canada or the United States, but because Canada is a British colony, technically speaking, the Crown still holds rights to our communities and our lands that were technically supposed to be allotted to Indigenous people. So these are more recent laws and things that have come up. I will sort of go through a little bit of this. What I do want to sort of focus on, because people think this is something of the past, people think this is something that is not happening. The Indigenous Act blatantly says that you cannot remove status. Sorry, the Indian Act, says that you cannot remove status. This was put into place as a protective piece of legislation for Indigenous people so that the unlawful removal of status wouldn't take place. However, if a bill does not get embedded into the Indian Act, if it's not forced to be embedded into the Indian Act, they can do whatever they please. So I come from a community that I only learned that I came from this community just before 2008. I was in post-secondary. I didn't have the means. I grew up in a single parent home. I didn't have the means to go back and forth to Newfoundland to create a connection and to build community there because I was basically a starving student. The Hailable Mi'kmaq Nation that I held status for up to 10 years. As of 2018, they took my status away because my Bill C-25 was not embedded into the Indian Act. There are lands that are attempted to be taken, like full reserve communities and lands that are allotted to Indigenous nations. There's particularly one in BC. And then there's, if you see the one that here says 2014, the land claims cases, they are still trying to target land to this day. And so this is what I'm talking about. These things didn't just start happening. They've been happening for years and years and years. And it creates this false narrative and this false representation of who our people are and why we protest and why we're angry all the time. When we look at just laws in general, not even the Indian Act, just laws in general, these are the things that already impacted women. Not even to talk about our communities that are people that are from the LGBTQ2S plus community. They had to go dormant, they had to hide because they weren't allowed to be who they were when Christianity started being imposed in our communities. This in particular, you didn't even have to be an Indigenous woman for this. This is what already impacted our women. We know this. We're still living this proof. We're still living the feminist movement because of these laws. Women and children were property of men. You couldn't do any of these things without having consent or permission, I should say rather, from the head of the household or a male figure or your father or your brother or an uncle if it had to be. We couldn't walk as women. Now, take this into consideration. And now this is what the Indian Act did to Indigenous women, on top of what women were already facing. It forced our communities to move from a matrilineal society, meaning following the mother's bloodline, to a patriarchal one. Not only were women and children property of men, but all Indigenous people became property of the state. So you're not even your own person. And then on top of that, you're also property of the man that you're with, or that the man that you're being forced to marry. It made Indigenous women legally white, wrote them down on paper as if they were a settler, and settler women legally Indian. This was around Bill C-31. And so what I mean by this is there was a time when the purpose of the Indian Act, and it blatantly says this, was to kill the Indian in the man and to forcibly dilute the bloodline. So what this meant, they began to target our women and forcibly marry them into settler communities, or forcibly sterilize them so that they would not be able to carry children and continue their bloodline. What this also meant was a version of disenfranchisement that meant if an Indigenous man married, and this is just facts, married a white woman, that white woman would gain full status, even though she had no Indigenous ancestry to her at all. Their children would carry full status. So you see the process here? They wanted to give status to non-Indigenous people so that eventually they could disseminate this whole idea of status that they created. Now, the reverse to this was if an Indigenous woman married out of her community to a non-Indigenous person, primarily a white man, or if she was forcibly married into these communities, whether she was taken as a slave or whatever the case may be, she completely lost her status and her children would have no rights to be able to apply or obtain status, even though, legally speaking, they would be considered half or whichever, and they would be able to obtain status. They weren't allowed. Now, one of the first cases that we know of this, and one of our first MMIW cases that we know of, is Pocahontas. Her name was not Pocahontas, her name was Sacagawea. She was a child when she was forcibly removed from her community. It's not this Disney variation that we see. Disney does this weird messed up thing. If you've ever taken English literature or dived into sort of the process of Disney, Disney takes very sick stories and flips them into this very romanticized version of what that story is. And this is the process of colonization. You take the story and you flip it to make it the story that you want it to become. And this is what settler communities did to Indigenous people. A lot of people don't know that these laws even exist. We still have the Indian Act today, and it's a double-edged sword, and they want it that way because if we eradicate it, some of the things are going to be a mess, and we need that for protection, whether it's through land claims, through status, through whatever. But then it's also the most racist piece of legislation and the only piece of legislation that is in existence that targets a whole entire race of people. So these are the things that we're constantly in the state of limbo between balancing something that we need to support and protect us versus something that is horrifying. You were not allowed to be a part of any band council, which was a colonial tactic to make all men and part of making the decisions, which had to then go through the Indian agents. That's what they were called. They couldn't make any decisions on the reserve. Not allowed to own property. If that family property was passed down to her, to a woman, if she married, that property automatically became the man's property. If that man died or divorced her, she was completely displaced. If she married into another community and that man had a piece of land, if they divorced or he died, not only did she have to worry about planning a funeral, she now had to worry about where she was going to live because automatically she had 30 days to evacuate. She had to leave. She was not allowed to stay because she was not allowed to obtain property and hold ownership. And the family would kick them out. Already hard for a woman to find employment or work or go to school. 10 times worse for Indigenous people. You also, if your husband was disenfranchised, automatically you lost status. So basically disenfranchisement meant that if you wanted to pursue higher education or better employment off the reserve or even in a different country, you had to choose to give up your status, which was not a choice, it was a forced choice, because if you wanted to sort of excel and attain your goals, you were forced to do something that you didn't want to do, but evidently you did it because you wanted to try to better your life and community. Your gift to society was the fact that you now became a Canadian citizen. And I say it like this for one particular reason. I want to use our military, our warriors as an example. When you are a military person, your family is taken care of. You are allotted a space in a military community for housing. You have access to medical. You have access to pretty good education opportunities for not only yourself, but your children. you have mental health supports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These were things that were provided to our veterans. When you were an Indigenous veteran and you said, yes, I want to stand up for my country and I want to fight for this country, when Indigenous veterans came back, they were like, what do you mean? You don't get these things. Your gift was becoming a Canadian citizen. That was your gift. They got nothing, absolutely nothing. And so when we hear these stereotypes of the drunken Indian and the old people, like the old Indians, like, oh, they're lining up on the alleyways. Many of our people who are on the streets are Indigenous veterans who had to forcibly disenfranchise themselves because they thought they were doing a good thing. They thought they were trying to support their families. And when they came back, ended up with absolutely nothing. Now, we know how strong PTSD is, post-traumatic stress disorder. We know how hard it is for our veterans to come back after war and to quote unquote live a normal life. Now, you leave somebody with no mental health supports and no access to medical when they come back. How do you expect them to survive? And then they're self-medicating to try to survive. And then we create these stereotypes and we shun them because they're struggling. Now amplify that with an entire race. You're not only doing this to Indigenous communities, this is happening to many different racialized communities. There's these undertones of a narrative that has been falsely portrayed for hundreds and hundreds of years to the general population, and we believe it. Why? Because it's ingrained into us in everything that we do. I look at novels and we see this romanticized version of the Indigenous damsel in distress with her long flowing black hair and in like a tight little hide leotard that is representative of Pocahontas, when that's not even the truth. And then you have our Indigenous men who have like an 8-pack and they're like this muscly tanned person again with the long hair that are like, oh, I'm lost and I need the white woman to save me. I need to be tamed because I'm a savage. These are the storylines that have been so fully ingrained in media, in movie representation, in books, in literature. We're not represented in the history books. The only thing that we talk about, especially when I was in school, was how the Indians befriended the Pilgrims, and still using the term like Indian in these textbooks. I've only seen in the last 2 years, in my lifetime, in the last 2 years, things beginning to shift within the education system. Even being able to have a conversation like this today, it's only been in the last 2 years that I think I've done quite enough or quite a lot of these presentations, but only in the last 2 years. And why is that? Because people don't know and they want it that way. They don't want us to know the truth. They don't want us to know, because then when we know, then we start to take a stand. And they don't want that. They want us to stay uneducated. And now the very bottom one I really want to pay mind to, a lot of folks in residential school, particularly our young girls, because they were so used to the abuse that they were facing, they desensitized and disassociated, which meant that this was taken as a very messed up storyline, in that because they didn't respond to the abuse that they were facing, maybe they didn't scream, maybe they didn't yell, maybe they didn't cry, that they liked it. That Indigenous women and girls like to be abused. They like to be kicked around. And I don't know about so much now, but I know when I was being groomed, there was a catalog, because we didn't have, like, the internet wasn't as extreme as it is now. It was just up and coming, but there was a catalog and you could choose which type, which race, which characteristics that you wanted of that person as a John. You could pick that person. And in these catalogs were a lot of Johns would be like, I want the Indigenous woman because I want to get my aggression out tonight. How messed up is that? Coming from an idea that started hundreds of years ago. So this is just a quick historical snapshot. I'm not going to go over this. That's something that I went over in some of the other workshops on helpingtraffickpersons.org. what I do want to say is that we are beginning to shift. Okay. These are the things that happened pre-contact. So our children were the root of our communities. We talk about sort of like a web. There's a spider teaching in my community that we talk about. And evidently what that means is the children are at the middle. They're the heart. They're the root of the drum. They are the heartbeat of the drum. And on the outside of them is the women, because they are the caregivers. They are the ones that are the life givers. They are the life bearers. They're the ones that are responsible for the water and taking care of those children. On the outside of the women are two-spirited individuals, because they can walk sort of in different spaces, and they can hold a lot of positions in spaces where if the women couldn't, or if the men couldn't, then they would pick up those roles and responsibilities. Outside of them are our men, our warriors, and then outside of them, it's like a wolf pack. So like the elders and the sick would be on the outside. And then you have your ancestors and your spirit guides on the outside of that, protecting you. And then you have Mother Earth. And so when you look at a wolf pack, right, you have like designated leaders that are at the front, you have the elderly and the sick, and then you have sort of like, there's the different levels in between. So it could be like the youth, it could be warriors in training, like mothers and children, and then the rest of the community. But at the very back is where the leader is. Now, in our communities, the reason why our elders would sacrifice themselves is because historically speaking, when we look at making connections with relationships, obviously parent to child, because parents are responsible for the initial stages of that life's journey. But across from the medicine wheel would be our elders, seniors, and then our youth. And the elders were not afraid to sacrifice themselves for the community, because they had youth, they were mentoring youth. Our youth had a strong connection with our elders, because they would begin to teach the youth the language, the customs, the ceremonies. And so by the time you reached adulthood, you would know these things. That hasn't been happening in quite some time. And so these are the things that we need to work on mending, and we are mending them. We're beginning to mend that relationship, but we can't sacrifice our elders right now, because our elders need healing just as much as the rest of the community. And we need to connect these people back together. We need to connect our communities back together again. And unfortunately, we're left with the trauma and the burden of doing this because something that was done to us. And it creates that domino effect, that constant domino effect. So we talked a bit about these things. There's this idea that the savage needs to be saved. The idea of the Indian Act was to kill the Indian, save the person. When we move into residential schools, they changed this in the Indian Act to say, kill the Indian, save the child. So, and this is terminology that was used in pieces of legislation. This is not something that I'm just saying. These are in the Indian Act. The first process of the Indian Act, that is exactly what it said. And it specifically also says, dilute the savage bloodline. So this is why these things were put into place. They just wanted to make it legislation so they can make it legal to do the things that they were doing. But we know, based off of history, we know based of a lot of the atrocities and genocide that has taken place, just because something is legal doesn't make it right. And then the romanticized and misrepresented imagery and storyline that has been perpetuated, and it leads to MMIWG. It's also, and when I'm talking about women, I'm talking about anybody who identifies as a woman, anybody that is encompassed in that category, but also acknowledging our two-spirit folks are also tremendously impacted by this as well. So I mentioned this stat earlier, 12 times more likely. So we only make up about 4 to 6% of the population, Indigenous people alone, 4 to 6% of the population. Yet I don't think I've ever met an Indigenous person, not even a woman, an Indigenous person who hasn't been abused in one way or another. When we compare the numbers, there's 17.2 million women specifically identified in Canada. 718,000 of those are Indigenous women in particular. When you look up of who is impacted by human trafficking, yes, the number for settler women is substantial, but that's only 20% of the population. If you look at Indigenous women, this is 50%, because we make up over 50% of human trafficked victims. 50%, and keep in mind again, we only make up, so if Indigenous people make up 4 to 6% of the population, Indigenous women only make up about 2 to 3% of the population, and the number is still significantly large. This is more, way more than what 20% of settler women identified. Compare those numbers. It is significant. Why are these things underreported? Begins with colonization. I'm not going to go through this entire list, but what I do want to bring your attention to is the harmful assumptions. Again, this false narrative that has been presented. Oh, she's a runaway, she's a sex worker, she was looking for it, she deserved it. There's still this messed up idea, just in general for women. Oh, close your legs. Oh, you liked it because you didn't push him off, which is not true. We know by cases that were just released in the news, that officer, I'm actually very thankful that they made him take his shirt off and they took that photo. Why? Because from the neck up, under his uniform, you saw nothing. So he could further perpetuate this false narrative that that person didn't push him off, which is still messed up to begin with. But when he took his shirt off, and you could see all of the scratch marks on him. We don't ask for this. Indigenous people don't ask for this. There was a case, I'm not going to mention the name right now, but there was a case where there was a missing persons report out. The police stopped her twice. She was in a vehicle twice with a missing persons report out. They didn't notify the family. They didn't take her in for any type of questioning or even for protection. Within a couple of weeks from there, she was found to be murdered. We do the things that we need to do, and we still are faced with this system of oppression. It doesn't stop because of this false narrative. We know in terms of charges, they vary from province to province, but usually 9 times out of 10, convictions don't result in a human trafficking charge. They result in some of these examples. It's very hard because you do need proof, and it's very hard to even get that proof. Why? Because they're monitored 24/7. They don't have proper access to phones, et cetera, et cetera. The blame, shame, guilt, embarrassment, the psychological damage that happens to individuals is worse than the physical trauma. And I say that because your mind can play tricks on you. Your mind can make you believe that you truly are stuck. You begin to believe that really nobody can help you. And the other part of it too is sometimes it takes a really long time for that safety level to increase. This is a game that exploiters are willing to continue to play, especially when it comes to Indigenous people. What we don't think about, obviously for most of us, we do know shelters, transition homes, group homes, certain youth agencies, they are targets for grooming. But industrial labor work camps, fisheries, trucking industry, tourists on vacations, or even tourists trying to go into remote reserve communities, this is all breeding grounds for trafficking. A lot of these pipelines that are being forced through Indigenous communities, there's this false narrative that is put into place to say that there's nowhere else to put it. It's a load of crock. Usually what happens is that there's multiple communities that are requested for it to go through, and the community denies it. And then what they're left with is going through an Indigenous reserve community, which is already a small pocket of land to begin with. What this brings though, because these workers know it's a hard life sometimes. And they know that a lot of Indigenous communities survive off of survivor sex just to accommodate their basic needs. Please look up food prices in Attawapiskat or food prices in remote flying communities. For a case of water, it is over $100 for a case of water. For a rotting out watermelon, it could be anywhere from like $20 to $40. For one apple, it could cost them $6 for one apple. But yet a case of pop, or like a bottle of pop, is $5 to $7. So how are you feeding your children? If your diapers are costing $300 just to get diapers and even formula, how are you living? And so sometimes they have to rely on survivor sex just to make ends meet, just to live, just to even have their basic necessities. Many of these pipelines have burst, and obviously we know have caused oil spills. It has contaminated waters, contaminated reserve lands. They're living in sheds. It's deplorable conditions, but yet we allow this in Ontario, or we allow this even across province. And it's because Canada doesn't like to look at the things that are happening in our own backyard. And we throw money at certain agencies, and great, that's fine. Programs are cool. But when somebody needs a food card or needs direct money for rent, for food, for clothing, it becomes a no-no. And because we have to battle this sort of dual processing because our funding structure comes from government or comes from non-Indigenous streams of funding. So these are the things that we need to think about. Cross-province child placement, a lot of children end up in non-Indigenous homes and end up across the province. This is not a new thing. This happened in residential schools. A lot of my family who grew up in the Maritime provinces were sent to BC or Saskatchewan or Manitoba. A lot of people from like Manitoba were sent to Ontario. Many children were even sent to like Russia. There's whole studies around like a huge chunk of the 60 Scoop survivors who were sent even out of the country. Look up Shannon's dream. So Shannon Kostashin was a young woman who actually died because of a drunk driver. But it's because a lot of our remote students, and like in remote reserves or even in certain reserves, there's no middle school or high school. So they're living the post-secondary life younger, which increases the susceptibility to be groomed and trafficked, especially if they're coming from a very small community into a city. There's a culture shock. There's also a price shock. There's accessibility to things that they've never had before. There's introduction to things like drugs and alcohol that they maybe never had access to before or that they didn't know about. They're living a university and college lifestyle while they're 12, 13, 14 years old. So they're introduced to things a lot sooner. You also, very similar to people who are labor trafficked, a lot of these youth end up in these boarding apartments, and then the landlord or whoever's there is like, well, you need to do this for me in order to stay here. You need to sleep with me, or you need to recruit people to work for me so that you can stay here and continue to live here. Now, here's your option. Continue to live out your goal and your dream of education and to at least just complete your high school degree, or tell. Again, that blame, shame, that embarrassment is super high. And again, false perception. So looking at the quote at the bottom, we are missing, but we are not missed. This is a powerful statement. This is often what our community feels. This statement here is also another one. I was careful not to say that I was an Indigenous woman because I knew if I did, I would experience the most violent and heinous acts in the sex trade. This is an Indigenous survivor. If you are here to learn, your responsibility now is to continue your education, to continue to learn and to continue to look at these things, learn about the history, learn about what's going on. I'm going to fly through the next little bit because I am noticing time and I tend to blab and talk a lot. But just a reminder, like, our women are our life givers. We need to protect them just as much as we need to protect Mother Earth. If the water goes, if the water is contaminated, then we go with it. Water is Mother Earth's lifeblood. We are protectors. Just as much as we are going through these atrocities, we're also trying to protect Mother Earth. Yes, we may be protesting laws and legislation, but we're protesting the oppression that's taking place. We need to protect the water and the land, because by doing that, we're also protecting our bodies. What we've seen, so yes, there's barriers, there's accessibility issues. However, we are moving into a path of reclamation. We need allyship, because sometimes our voices are not heard, and that's purposeful. That's a purposeful tactic. We need allies to come in and speak loudly for us until there's a level of our voices being heard, and we can come in and pick up the rest of that. We're not asking you to fix us. We're not asking you to do these things for us. What we need is support at the beginning so that we can then create space. Now, just very quickly, I want to bring up residential schools a little bit. This is a picture of me and my Mi'kmaq grandmother. I've seen this ancestral mathematics going around social media. Look at the amount of people it takes for you to be here today. 4,094 people, just for you, one person to be sitting here today. That is significant. Now, my grandmother refused to talk about her experience in boarding school. She only at the age of 80, when she obtained her status, was she finally opening up about it. And then she got sick and passed 4 years later. Many of her stories, like so many of our families, those stories have gone to the grave with them because of that blame, shame, and guilt. She enforced in us, you're Mi'kmaq, but we're not going to talk about that, because what you are is you're Newfie. That's who you are. That's what we'll talk about, because that was the only thing that they felt pride in at the time. But what this also meant is this: a lot of the famine, disease, purposeful murder, the mass child graves of residential schools, our community members dying of addictions, mental health concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That meant that this process impacted our populations significantly. There are bloodlines who have been completely eradicated because of this process. This is what MMIW is continuing to do to us today. You target our women, you target our life givers, and you're completely disseminating entire populations, entire ancestral bloodlines. And so I wanted to bring up this image because you can see some of the growth and what we're finally starting to walk into, what we're finally starting to do on this journey of reclamation, on this journey of education, on this journey of continuing to move forward. Is, yes, we see the atrocities, we see all of these things, but this is the reminder of the struggles that they face, but that we're starting to create pride in our children again, in the next generations. Our young people are so amazing. I've done so much work with youth and even our young adults, and to see the pride that they begin to feel in who they are. I use the example, I'll just leave this up and go through them as I'm talking. I use the example of myself. So the reason why I put the image of me in a jingle dress at the beginning of every presentation I do is for a couple of things. Each jingle was prayed over for my community and for the people that I had lost, my clients that I had lost while I was working for a number of years. I didn't have that. I didn't have that confidence before. And even still to this day, because it's been so innately ingrained in me that it's a weird thing to be an Indigenous person. I cannot, because when I get ready, I get all my hair pieces and my braids in first, and I show up to the powwow grounds and I just put my dress on and the rest of my accessories. Whereas my partner just gets dressed at the powwow grounds just because that's the way the process is. But there's times where I've gotten out of the car to go get coffee before we go to the powwow, and I'm in my beadwork and I have everything in it. And it's nothing for me to wear my beaded earrings. Like, I wear my beaded earrings all the time. But to have all my powwow stuff in my and my head stuff in, I become the spectacle. And in my brain, because that blame, shame, and that deep rooted narrative that has been instilled in our communities, I feel a sense of shame and I want to hide. And I shouldn't have to feel that way. I don't feel that way now, but for the time, I should not have had to feel that way. It is nothing for us to see anybody else in their cultural regalia walking down the street. Why is it such a spectacle for Indigenous people when we're in our regalia to feel that way, or to even watch us as a spectacle? And that's because of this false narrative. And so just very briefly, the idea of this, there's some differences and similarities. As you know, the presentation will be available. What I can do is send these slides to the facilitators, and they can also potentially post them or send them out. But the idea of two-eyed seeing is exactly what I do in the work. But also, like, if I use a youth program or my youth program as an example, the governing bodies and the principles that structuralize the way the funding goes is Western ideology and perspective. So I need to take the strengths from that. They're giving me money to run a program. I have some protocols that I have to follow and guidelines from them, but how can I infuse and blend in my Indigenous perspective and worldview? And part of that is negotiating terms and also coming to an understanding that spirituality is important. Having access to paying elders and knowledge keepers is important. Talking about the teachings are important. Being able to provide traditional crafting and even traditional food sometimes is important. And then you blend that together. So some of like systemic things that you talk about, or education that you talk about, how to navigate systems, that's on the Western perspective. And then the other pieces are Indigenous perspective and worldview over here. And you blend them together to create a program. That's an example of two-eyed seeing. And so again, these are just sort of examples of, this is like in the medical field, and you're like weaving back and forth is what he talks about between the different perspectives and worldview. These are just some images that I really liked. Check out these links, take a photo of these links. There are fantastic Indigenous activists and young people and our knowledge keepers and elders that are out there, our performers, our musicians. We are actually, our community members are now being nominated for Juno Awards and music awards and activist awards and artist awards and all of these things. And it's fantastic. And so the fact that we're starting to get recognition for the work that we've been doing, starting to get recognition just as Indigenous people, is paramount into helping to combat this. Education is important. I'll sort of leave these up, but I'm pretty sure I blabbed a lot. So I'll leave these up if there's any quick questions that are coming through.
There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Mel, for that wonderful presentation. And yes, we do have your slides that you sent to us in advance. Perfect. So we will email out a link to those slides in a follow-up, because you've got a lot of links there that I'm sure folks are going to want to check out. So we do have just a couple of minutes left. If you have questions for Mel, you can raise your hand and I'll invite you to unmute. Keep in mind we are recording this session, or you can, I have turned the chat box back on, so you can drop your questions in the chat there. Folks a minute to maybe type something out. Getting lots of thank yous right now in the chat.
Oh, awesome.
Oh, wait, I see a question. Yes. Ask to unmute.
Okay, thank you for unmuting me. Mel, my name is Amakaya, and I just wanted to say that was, I sent you the message in the chat, but just wanting to also verbalize it to you. That was a very powerful presentation. Definitely really appreciate everything that you shared. Somebody's already asked my question. So Linda, we were on the same wavelength around, you know, a specific place or organization that specializes in helping the victims. Was my question, like where would we connect those people to?
So I always say
Sorry, that was our question, Linda. I'll go on mute now.
I always say in some cases it depends on the individual, because sometimes it's not necessarily the agency, it's the worker that they want to be with. And so one of my old mentors, like as she traveled from agency to agency, like the community went with her, right? Because they felt safe and they don't want to have to tell their story again. So sometimes that's what you're looking at, is just to connect them with maybe people that they've worked with in the past, or working with somebody that they know is safe. Some of the other locations, and so they Native Child and Family Services, in the position that I used to work for, was the Pocahontas program, so the anti-human trafficking program. They continue to work with survivors and help with that process. Now, I just want to be very mindful when we say escape, sometimes immediately pulling them out is unsafe. I know most of you on this call probably know that there needs to be a particular plan in place, and it has to fit what that person needs in that moment. If there's children involved, that's a little bit different. Sometimes it can get a little bit choppy. Unfortunately, we need more supportive housing. That is obviously a systemic barrier. Native Women's Association or Native Women's Resource Center as well. There's different pockets of Indigenous agencies. So Anishinaabe Health can support with that. What are they called? The AIM program. I can't remember the acronym, but Suzanne Smoke does a lot of amazing, phenomenal work within the Indigenous community with survivors. I'm trying to think of more. There's like different pockets of people. I've directly worked with like managers or executive directors of like, say, victim witness protection or victim services to specifically grab a worker on their team that I know would fit the client that I'm working with. Yeah, police reporting does not, yes, absolutely. And so the hard part, yeah, Native child can be a little bit hard. Native women's is one. I'm trying to think of more. There's Undayan, there's Alosa in I think Northern Ontario. I'm trying to think of like the little pockets that it's not clicking right now. But yeah, sometimes, especially in the Indigenous community, so this is the other thing too, is like there's so much that we can't even acknowledge our Two-Spirit community and I try to blend it in as much as possible. But this is also something that's being reclaimed, as well as our biracial Indigenous folks. Like these are worlds that like I can't speak to that because obviously I'm not from those communities, but we need to have these conversations of this dual oppression that takes place with these multitude of identities, and like not just being a woman, but also like having different races and being from different like sub communities. Like if you are also that plus a part of the LGBTQ, like it's all amplified. And so I think for me, what I try to say is like connect them to somebody that they talk about or mention, or some of those services. Sometimes it could be an elder, sometimes it could be a knowledge keeper. Even sometimes it's not even about connecting them to specific services at all. It's about in some cases I've had to just focus on employability development and connecting them to programs until they felt ready and safe enough to leave the situation, and or just to create that level of understanding that there is something else out there for them, because sometimes they don't even know, like there's so much psychological stuff going on that they can't process that, hey, I could actually learn how to do a craft and I can sell those crafts. I can be self-sustaining, or that people actually care for them, or that there's a community out there that's willing to sit with them and lift them up in their gifts. And so sometimes it's not even about the rescue mission or the escape. Sometimes it's you have to sort of come at a backdoor approach in order to get them to a space where they feel confident to do that. And there's also a lot of Indigenous people, because the Indigenous community is so large, but also very tight knit and very big, is there's a lot of like family or community members that have grown up with them that now work at these agencies, these Indigenous specific agencies, that they don't want to go there. So then you have to find an appropriate mainstream service that would help them. It's a very hard answer to really give a solid answer to. A lot of folks are helping me out and putting like Onwa, Native Women's and everything in the chat. Yeah. Why is it especially dangerous to identify as Indigenous for all the systemic views that you identified? So with the false narrative, Indigenous women become targets of extremely violent acts. With surviving residential school, with some of the other pieces that have come up, priests who have perpetuated harm, as well as other men in different communities, non-Indigenous men. There's this narrative that Indigenous women like the abuse, that they deserve the abuse, that they need to be, if they're catty, they need to be beaten into submission. And then on the other end, it's if they're quiet and they're silent, it means that they like it. And so this idea creates this long-standing narrative and this long-standing target that Indigenous women are either they need to be submissive, they need to be forced into submission, or they like it, and so we're going to continue to abuse them. The other part too is because of this narrative and because of the very hard relationship with police and authority and the lack of them believing our communities, it doesn't create this safety net around us. And unfortunately, we see this usually in communities where a non-Indigenous person, there's an Amber Alert for a child, or there's a missing persons report, and within a couple of days, that person is found. If you're looking at the Indigenous community or even the Black community, we know this is a huge issue. We have a missing persons report, it doesn't go on the news. If we have a child, an Amber Alert, it maybe went out a week late. And we know in these cases that time constraint is super important. That first 48 hours to 72 hours is the most important time frame. And half the time there's not even a follow-up for these families. There's times where our own people have to create our own search teams and go find our own people because authorities don't step up and do things. Then it's also this, obviously we don't have time, I'm trying to talk as fast as I can. There's this argument and this fight between which governing body is supposed to help and sort of mandate our people, as everybody else goes under provincial law. Indigenous people are technically under federal law, but then the federal government and the provincial government like to battle it out between each other and say, no, it's you, and no, it's you. And then evidently we fall through the cracks and nothing happens. If you look up, what is it called? Oh, I can't remember what it's called right now, but there was an issue where a young Indigenous boy needed medical attention, and he essentially died because of how long the government was taking to agree to who was going to pay for the medical stuff. This is the BS that we deal with. This is a governmental structure that continues to fail us. Shannon's Dream is not a book. It's a collective and an initiative that was put on by Shannon Kostashin. If you just type in Shannon's Dream in Google, you'll find what the idea of the initiative was about. Best way to contact me, mel@canadianroots.ca.
I think we've hit on
Jordan's principles, Jordan's law. Sorry, I just wanted to Varka, you just kind of sent it directly to me. Can you put it publicly? If Canada moves into full legalization of prostitution, will that put Indigenous people? Absolutely. It puts any survivor at risk. It puts any victim of human trafficking at risk regardless. But how many folks actually know how expensive food is in remote reserve communities? How many of you even know how many reserves are in Ontario? I don't even know the answer to that question. And so this is the thing, they don't want us to know, because then we're not going to go up and do the work. The other thing is a lot of teachers or counselors, like these flying communities, they only have access to a doctor once a year, maybe even if that. Nurses barely go up there. You have educators that are paid extra, non-Indigenous educators that are paid extra to go up into these communities to teach these children. They disappear after a year. So where is the relationship building? There's no relationship and continuity, which further perpetuates trafficking. Why? Because they're vulnerable. They don't have mental health professionals that are consistent. They don't have doctors that are consistent. Their supports are so inconsistent. Why are you going to tell your story 50 times in your life? You don't want to do that. That's further traumatizing them. But apparently to the government, this seems like it's okay for our people to go through this. As well as we know, majority of you on this call know, you cannot do harsh trauma work while your basic needs are not being met. Half the time, this is why our communities and why our survivors end up in the sex trade to begin with, because their needs are not being met. It's particularly for racialized communities. Now, that becomes amplified, 5 times more amplified when you're in a remote reserve community, or even a community that doesn't have access to clean drinking water, or doesn't have access to proper amounts of prices for food. How are you going to survive? And then you're more susceptible to the violence. And like I said, it's not just happening when you're 18, 19, 20 years old experiencing the university lifestyle. This begins to happen at age 9, at age 10, right? So 3 pieces of fruit, $10, case of Coke, $54, outrageous prices. Yes, absolutely. Somebody has a question. I just want to mention, for those of you who need to jump off, you can absolutely jump off. I'll stay on as long as I can if you're willing to stay on. It's totally up to you guys. Yeah, go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, Mel, thank you very much for a very, very powerful presentation. So when we talk about the cost of food, nutritious food to live, the liquor in the reserve area, is the cost of liquor just as high, or is it lower, or is it the same as the rest of Canada?
Lower. It's absolutely lower.
Okay, so it's very, very obvious that they are trying to make the community into, depending on the alcohol, so that they sit home and do nothing. And it's very annoying. I have enjoyed driving, through the reserves, and enjoyed meeting with people. And there was one reserve, we were just passing by on the road. The only thing that we saw within that reserve was the LCBO. And it took us 1 second to pass by that, reserve. I'm sure the people were inside, but LCBO was the most prominent, building there. And what can you say about that?
Somebody just said increases violence, and yeah, it also increases submissiveness. When you bring in substances, depending on your level of trauma and depending on what's going on around you, either you perpetuate the stereotypes that have been placed or you become submissive to control. And that's what it is. It's to continue to keep our people here rather than being able to elevate ourselves and to see the good in life, right? I have privilege. I am somebody who is mixed. I have settler background as well as Mi'kmaq. I always in spaces, I have to recognize my own privilege just as much. I may not have been raised in the culture, but this is a system that is meant to further continue to keep us lower. When they brought us into residential schools, there was a promise of higher education. What they taught us was roles of servitude. They specifically had our young girls learning how to sew, mend, stitch, and nurse people back to health, nurse their people back to health, mind you. And they had our men doing domesticated construction roles. Where's the growth in that? Like, and absolutely, like, not to say that people in those industries aren't needed. Absolutely, they are needed, and they're so paramount. But these industries have actually grown and progressed. But back then, when this first started, it was meant to keep us in roles of servitude so that we wouldn't grow, so that we wouldn't educate ourselves about our own people, and that we wouldn't know how to move forward. The other part to that is, like, how many of you have gone up to Casino Rama? Like, I'm sure a lot of us probably have. That none of that money gets filtered into the community. Rama is a reserve. How many of you have driven past Casino Rama, or the casino, actually into the reserve? Probably not many of you. And this is the point. There is a world past the casino that people don't even know even exists. But part of that is because we're taught to go for entertainment. We as a society, and that's by no fault of you, but that's we go to these places. I only went because my aunt was going to grab something from one of the smoke shops on the reserve. But how many cars are usually sitting at the casino, right? And never even knowing that there's a whole other world, because we're not taught to go the extra mile. We're not taught to actually explore and critically analyze what's going on. It's the same reason why now, like, no offense to some of you on the call, if you're anti-vaxxers or anti-mask people, that whatever, do you, but I'm a survivor. I just recently came out of having COVID. I mask up, I sanitize, I do everything I need to do to keep my family safe. I have an autoimmune condition. I need to be mindful and careful of that. But I still see people in my building walking around without masks on. It's because we have some people who believe right side of the brain, left side of the brain. We have some people who believe certain things, some people who believe other things, which fine, you want to like live your life. I'm not living your life for you, I'm living my life. But when it comes to the harm of other people, we need to be mindful of the things that we're doing. It's not just around having a pandemic. This is around everything. We're not taught to critically analyze the crap that goes down in our systems. And when we do, we get shunned for it. When we do, we get thrown in jail, or we have water cannons blasted at us, or we have pepper spray blasted at us. Those of us who are out in the streets protesting, it's not for no reason. We're protesting something that has been made legal that shouldn't have been made legal. We see this with everything that has happened in history, but yet we're doomed to repeat it because certain people in positions of power want that power and want to continue with that control. They want to remain on top. It's the same pattern for Indigenous people. We continue to see the cycle of continuing to suppress and oppress this community so that they don't rise above. Because see, this is the thing, and sorry, not sorry, Canada does not want to recognize the genocide that it's continued to perpetuate. My own niece and nephew, they're non-Indigenous. My sister and I have different fathers. They're non-Indigenous. And I remember years ago when she was in elementary school coming home with a school assignment that actually had words like Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wigwam, like things that we never were taught in school. They're starting to learn it. And she goes, but I've never met an Indigenous person. I've never met somebody who's First Nations. And I was shocked, but I also wasn't shocked. And I had to sit with her and say, sweetheart, I'm your auntie and I'm an Indigenous person. And I had to explain it to her. This is what we're talking about. Sorry, I tend to go off on tangents. So Leah just said we'll send out the follow-up slides with my email, or the slides with my email, and the link to the other webinars. Check out the message for your certificate. The process of colonization has led to people seeing themselves as individuals and not a part of a greater community. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing that we need to do. We need to learn to critically analyze things that we're being taught. Even in our own communities, there's sometimes self-proclaimed elders and knowledge keepers, or people who say that they know it all. And I always say, walk away from those people. It took me years to even get to a space where I could inform people about this information. It takes a long time to learn. So nobody's asking for you all to learn it all. Be kind and be gentle with yourself in this process, because it is a lot, and there's going to be feelings and there's going to be things that come up. And it's super hard to fight for my own community as well as trying to be there for other communities as well. But we have to do that. We need to do that. We need to stand up for each other, because it's only going to work as we continue to come together. Right. So I think I'm going to end it there. I'm going to stop responding to questions because it is 3:20 and I want to be cognizant of time. But Walala and Walaliok to all of you for being here. Thank you for listening to me blab and continue the conversation. But yeah, check out some of the other webinars, and I hope to share space with everybody again sometime soon on our journey.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, for your time today, Mel. I think this feels like the start of a conversation, not the completion of a series. So folks, do stay tuned. We'll send out some emails, some follow-up, and we're already in conversations talking about what other events we might have to further this conversation and some of the others that have been brought up with this webinar series. So Chimigwech, Mel, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your time. Thank you to everyone who's participated today. I see that over 60 of you have stuck around, and that's great. So that shows that everyone felt that this was worthwhile and that they're learning something from it. Thanks so much.